Hello folks, welcome to the channel. This Christmas I got a Dominion box set that had been sitting around for a while. I'm not super interested in the Stormcast side of things, I have almost 5,000 points of them already. What really caught my eye were the Kruleboyz. I collect 40k orcs, and I'm a big fan of the scrappy junkyard aesthetic they have. But I also like the stealthy, sneaky gits aspect that we only really see in the Commandos kit. So I'm excited to paint up some swampy guerrilla fighters, and what better place to start than with the Hobgrot Slittaz. I really like the idea of the Kruleboyz proper being dressed in muddy greens and browns, while the yellow grots are running around and drawing fire. I wanted to try something different from my normal 40k color scheme for Gretchen, and I've seen some really great schemes online that lean into that heavy yellowish green effect. I've also seen a lot of saturated orc schemes, swapping around the shadows and highlights to create a very intense hue the whole way through, and I wanted to try something like that with these Slittaz. I also wanted to try doing more of a somewhat speed painty, more tabletop standard, to see if I can make them intense and stand out from 3 feet away with that bright yellowish green. So, let's paint some super saturated Slittaz. For this tutorial, we're just going to be working on the squad leader, the standard bearer, and the musician. I've primed all of these in black. This is just Vallejo Mecha Black. Doesn't really matter because we're going to be going over this with Vallejo model color Violet. I'm going to be spraying this through the airbrush, 0.4mm needle and nozzle, around 25 psi, a little more than 1 part thinner to paint. I find that this paint tends to clog a lot in the airbrush. And we're just going to lay down a nice, solid base coat here to be the foundation of our scheme. This is how we achieve that saturated effect. Normally, the paints that you would be using for your shadows, you might mix in some more black, or have a darker, maybe desaturated version of your mid-tone color. And for your highlight, you would mix in a little bit more white. This gives you some nice contrast and value, but it removes a lot of that hue on the upper and lower end. So for this scheme, we want to keep that hue, that saturation, and we're going to achieve this by having purple as our shadow color and a yellow as our highlight color. So we're laying down this violet here to get that nice, warm, saturated shadow that we're then going to work over with some leather brown from Vallejo game color, as distinct from Vallejo model colors leather brown, which we will also be using later. This is a wonderful orangey brown paint, and this is going to keep that warmth and that saturation as we spray it directly from above here using the same settings as previously. And we're going to see in a second, this gives a wonderful contrast while keeping that very strong shadow color in the bottom there. These 3 were basically my tester models for this scheme. I haven't really tried something like this before. I learned quite a bit going through this. I like how the effect turned out. I would make a few modifications for the next 17 grots that I still have to paint. I would probably use more of a violet ink for the first step, and maybe a more orangey color, mix in a little bit of a different brown that I have. I'm not sure. I'll figure it out when I work on the next 17 models, and I'll post some updates on my blog if I find something good. So we've blocked out our basic contrast with our highlight, and we're going to be expanding on this with Vallejo model color Green Ochre as our secondary highlight. This is got a little more white in it, it's a little more desaturated. We're going to go back and work on that, but this is more to add some value. So we have our violet, we have our leather brown, and just focusing on the upwards facing sections closer to the top of the model. So you see the shoulders here, the face, kind of ignoring the legs. We want those to be a little bit darker, but this is going to make it actually brighter. I went a little bit overboard with that on some of the models. I did come back in with some violet and sprayed some shadows back in there. And we're going to give this all a once over with Citadel Nazdrag Yellow through the airbrush. This is just going to tint it. You saw that nice yellowy orangey brown color. This is going to tint it and bring back that hue a little bit. We have our highlight, we have our contrast in value, and we're going to tint this again and bring back some more of that yellow, some more of that green that we were working on there. Recently, I've grown to be a pretty big fan of using these contrast paints with the airbrush. I find they give a really nice effect when you're trying to tint something. So next we're going to come in with some Citadel Moot Green. This is a really nice yellowy green, and we're going to be using a brush for this. I want to get rid of some of that airbrush smooth fade texture and get some nice rough skin, because these are grots. These are nasty little creatures that live in a swamp, and we want to make them look like that. So we're going to thin this down, and as you can see there, use a little stippling motion. Again, further up on the model, on the shoulders, the arms, the back of the neck, and the face. We want to avoid the legs and feet, because we don't want to draw attention to that. We want to draw attention to the top of the model. And this is going to be a little bit lighter, and also bring in some more of that yellow, which we're going to be using as our final highlight color. Again, we're bringing up that value, but we're not adding white, we're not going into pastel territory, we're still keeping it very saturated with that yellow effect there. And I just have this thinned down quite a bit on my wet palette, and I'm just doing this little tippy-tappy, scratchy motion, sort of stippling this on, which also breaks that up and gives us some nice texture there. Now we're going to move on, and we're just going to apply one final layer of highlights to the very topmost areas, the top of his head, the top of his shoulders, and this is going to be a 50-50 mix of Moot Green to Uriel Yellow. Again, using that yellow as our final color, we keep that nice hue in there, and we're just going to go over in that same thinned down paint, in that same stippling motion, and just glaze this, stipple this a little over the topmost areas, so that we can really make it pop. When we did that Nazdrag yellow, we kind of went over those purple shadows and dulled them down a little bit more. You can still see them if you turn the model fully upside down, but I wanted to make sure that, this model still pops from a distance, especially if this is going to be on the table. And I really wanted to get more of that yellow-green color in there. But I didn't want to, just spray Moot Green and call it good, so. And we're just going to use some Rakarth flesh here to paint over all the little scars that these dudes have. There's a lot of them on the musician model in particular, but there's, little straight scars and crisscross scars. And this is going to be our last step before we hit it with a coat of gloss varnish and move on to the oil wash. So use any gloss varnish you'd like, and I'm going to be using Abtelung 502 Sepia. This is an oil paint, so I'm thinning it down with some mineral spirits. This is a very, very thin wash, as you can see here. This is much more of a filter that we're making. And we're just going to put this all over the model, tint it a little bit, filter it, and really concentrate it on the legs and the lower areas to darken those down. But again, we've just finished making the highlights a little bit lighter and more intense with that Moot Green and Uriel Yellow. Now we're going to want to make the shadows more intense with this sepia color. You could also use something like Agrex Earthshade or Seraphim Sepia if you don't want to use oils, but I like the effect that these give. So I'm just going over the model, putting a little filter over it, and in a minute get some of the paint off my brush, go back in and just make sure that there's no pooling on the back and the upper areas of the model. And then just hit it with a matte varnish when you're done. Now we're coming in with Flayed One Flesh, and this is fairly thinned down. We're just going to highlight those scars, again, make them pop. At some point I also, off camera, painted the fangs and teeth with Morghast bone from Citadel and highlighted them with Screaming Skull. The fangs and teeth and the skull at the top of the Standard Bearer's banner. Now we're using Leather Brown from Vallejo Model Color, very different color, and we're going to be painting this over all of the thicker cords at the top. So you can see that thick cord that's going across his shoulder. We're going to be painting that as well as the loincloths and any leather pouches. This is a nice dull brown to break up the skin. And we're going to use some Dryad Brown now, painting all the wooden details, so the banner on the Standard Bearer, as well as the handles on the little clubs that they have at their back. I think they're clubs. The little clubs that are hanging from their belts. And we're also going to use this to pick out the details on those little leather cords that we just painted. So, not quite dry brushing, but removed a lot of the moisture and a lot of the paint, and just going over and getting the upper areas of those. You could probably ignore this if you really wanted to, but this is one of the ways that you could cut this out if you wanted to make this game a little faster. I wanted to get this to a nice tabletop standard because I take forever painting my models and I need to get 20 of these guys done, but I still think I spend too much time on them. Now we're going to be using some Karak stone, and we're going to be painting this on the knots, the tassels, and we're going to mix this with a little bit of Dryad bark and use that to highlight the wood. So all these little tassels we're going to paint with Karak stone, the little knots on those thicker cords, and 50-50 Karak stone to Dryad bark, use that to highlight the wood. Went back and forth on how I was going to do the metals of the armor. I looked through my bronze bin, I wanted something reddish to contrast, and I settled on Scale 75 Decayed Metal. This is a wonderful paint, I love this paint so much. And we're just going to go over all of the armor plating. So all the armor plating on the front, some of the squares on the Standard Bearer, not all of them, just some of them. We're going to hit any of the arm rings, any of the weapon hilts and handles, and hit the rings on that horn that he's got there, leaving the middle sections free. That matte varnish that we did after the oil paints is going to be our only varnish on this model, but these Scale 75 paints are fantastic. I've never had a problem with them rubbing off or chipping without using a varnish, so these should be perfectly fine to stay on their own. Now we're going to highlight that decayed metal with some Army Painter Fanatic True Copper. I'm just going to be using an old frizzy brush, and we're just going to be lightly dry brushing this on here. Probably should have used a smaller brush. I eventually switched to a smaller brush, but just getting the edges and the raised little knobbly bits. And we're just going to go over, and again keeping that red warm tone but going up in value. I think this reddish bronze contrasts very nicely with the skin. Now we're going to be painting the rest of the iron with a 50-50 mix of burnt iron to Iron Warriors. Saw this on Cult of Paint a little while back, and I have fallen in love with it. It's a fantastic mix. Keeps the fluidity of the Vallejo metal color with the intensity of the Iron Warriors. And we're just going to be going over all the remaining metal bits. So this is the blades, the little heads of the clubs, the remaining squares and nails on the Standard Bearer, and the remaining parts of the horn. Getting that nice, dark, dirty metal. Now we are going to be highlighting the iron with, I just mixed in a little bit of Vallejo metal color aluminium in there, and I'm using a slightly smaller brush and just sort of lightly dry brushing it on there. You could use Iron Breaker, you could use even a lighter silver if you wanted to. We're going to be washing this, but just get a little bit of contrast and a little bit of texture on there too. And then we're going to be washing everything with Dark Oath Flesh contrast paint. So I'm using a moderately sized brush, and I'm just taking this straight out of the pot, going over and this gives a wonderful reddish-brown tone to everything. As you can see, I'm putting it all over there, and then I'm dabbing a little bit of it off, not thinning this at all, and it turns that silver into sort of rusty, sort of dirty, who knows what effect we're doing, but works very well. It keeps it nice and warm too. Do not do this on the teeth, the bone, the wood, the skull. We want to keep those as they are. This is just over the metallics that we're doing right now. And in a second, I'm going to take a smaller brush, and I'm going to be putting this over all of the Karak stone. So this is again going to warm it up a little bit, add some nice contrast to it. We're not going to be doing this over the leather brown because it's already in a pretty good spot. Now, we do have this cartoonish little blood drip on the sword, and I'm just using Bold Pyro Red and Orange Red from Krill. You don't have to use these red paints, just use any nice red that you have. I like them because they're very intense. And I'm just going over with the Bold Pyro Red while it's still wet, taking a little bit of that orange red, dabbing it in there. And then while that's still wet, I'm taking a little bit of orange ink, just any orange would do, and just dabbing that in there too. It's a pretty cartoony effect, but it's a pretty cartoony sculpt, so. I'm not the biggest fan of when they try and sculpt in stuff like blood or snot. I feel like it always looks out of scale and a little goofy. But I think it does work for orcs better than it does for some other factions. I'm just going in with, this is, I think, Green Stuff World, Amber Orange, Candy Ink, just some orange as your final highlight, and just dab it in there while it's all wet and just sort of blend it. Don't go crazy with it. Now we do the bases. I am not very good at basing. I just have a couple of basing schemes that I pretty much swap around for my armies. In this case, we're going to be using some of AK's Terrain Muddy Ground. Just dabbing this onto the base with a nice big brush. Get this on the feet a little bit. Don't be super precious with this. They live in a swamp. Thin this down a little bit. You can get it on the feet. You can just sort of dab it around. You might have seen I got a little bit on his helmet there for a second. Occupational hazard. We'll go and wipe that off in a minute. And just get this on the base to start with. And I felt like the base was missing something. I wanted to add a little bit of a slime, putrid look to it. So I'm using some Vallejo yellow fluorescent paint. And just while it's still wet, dabbing this in there a little bit straight from the bottle. And I'm getting some pretty big bubbles, so I'm going to try and get rid of those so they don't dry and give me a weird texture. I'm not sure if this effect turned out quite the way I was thinking it would. This would be a very good effect for something like Nurgle. I'll definitely be using this for my Death Guard in the future, but it's a little bit more of a Nurgle swamp than an Orc swamp, but I don't know. I think it looks good. For these guys, at least. Faces and bases, that's what you want to... If you nail those, your models are going to look great. And we get that nice yellowish green back in there, too. So you can see it's dried. That's the yellow fluorescent. It's a little bit glossier. And we're just going to go over with some Agrax Earthshade Gloss. Honestly, the new Agrax is pretty glossy on its own anyway. You could probably just use that. And I'm just going to go over all of this, making it look wet like it is in a swamp. Just slop this on there. And then we're going to go back in with that yellow fluorescent in a second. Dab that in there and really make sure that effect remains intense, like some sort of slime. Some of these models also have little mushrooms or other flora sculpted onto their base, so if you also just hit those with the yellow fluorescent, then it'll look like a strange glowing mushroom. of some variety. There we go. Just dab this straight from the bottle. Let it fall in there. And you got yourself a nice little slime effect. And finally, we're just going to use some German camo black-brown from Vallejo's Panzer Aces, and we're going to use that to paint the base rims. And at this point, we're pretty much done. So this is my first time trying this sort of effect, this super saturated effect. I think it turned out fairly well. I kind of lost the violet shadows after a couple of those airbrush layers. I think that some of them weren't entirely necessary. I'm going to try out a few different things when I paint the remaining grots, and I'll post any updates, but I think that the metallics in particular turned out very well. The contrast paints tend to dull everything down, I've found. They give it a nice sort of matte finish, which I actually kind of like on my metallics, so I decided to keep that. For the bones and skulls, I again just Morghast bone, stippled a little bit of Screaming Skull, and then a little bit of Wraith bone on the top there. For some reason, the pictures that I take on my phone always turn up the saturation a little bit. It's that and the lighting that I'm using for these pictures, but even in person, these do stand out from 3 feet away, so I think that part of my goal was achieved. I still took like 2 or 3 hours per grot after fussing around with the airbrush and all that. It would be a little shorter if I were doing more of them at once, but still pretty long for a tabletop standard. But they look decent and weren't too bad to actually get done, so there's that. But yeah, I think this was a good learning experience. If you want to see a text guide, I have more pictures posted on my blog, buyeroftheblade.blogspot.com. Check that out. I also post updates and future projects I'm going to be working on. So, future projects on my radar include my custom Stormcast scheme, which I will be working on some of the models from Dominion, as well as the rest of the Kruleboyz. I definitely want to hit the Gut Rippas and at least one of the characters. But other than that, I think we're done for now. See you in the next video.